Perfect. It looks like we are good to go. All right. Excellent. So we'll just get started for sake of time, and people will continue to join as we move along. Welcome, everybody, to our second installment on the estate planning strategies or estate planning 101. Today, we are excited to announce that we have Jay with us, Jay Papernick, who's also an Asante advisor, but he's our team's insurance specialist. So he's going to talk about various strategies to consider when looking at your estate and some of the tax liabilities that you may have within your estate, and how to use insurance as a tool outside of just strictly insurance. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself, so I'll just pass on to Jay. But before I do so, I'm just going to mention, as usual, there's the chat feature or the Q&A button where you can ask questions as we go along while we have the expert on the line. And I'm going to add a link in the chat, which is our joint calendar. So if you wanted to book a call with Jay and myself after the call, we'd be more than happy to do that. And you could just click the link and it'll send you to our joint calendar. And it's probably a good thing to do if this call resonates with you, because Jay is obviously going to speak very generally and not give any specific examples. And by specific, I mean obviously specific to anyone on the call. So if you like the illustrations that Jay will be presenting, we could look at a personal one-on-one presentation that will look at your actual numbers. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Jay. So
Great.
Jay, take it over.
Thank you very much, Mike. So nice to see everyone, although I don't actually see anybody's faces except for Mike and Nick, but that's okay. As Mike said, I am the insurance specialist for Mike's team. We've done a lot of interesting planning solutions together over the years, and I'm excited to speak to all of you today. I really have not a huge agenda, so please interrupt me. I tend to talk fast, so please slow me down if there's a question or if you're not getting something or if you want me to repeat something. Basically, I want to talk about, the subject is like the overlooked tool in estate tax planning. So what does estate tax planning mean? And does it always just mean insurance? By the way, the answer is no, it doesn't. So as much as I like to sell the stuff and I like people to understand it and to really use it properly, estate planning doesn't always mean you need insurance. In fact, often it doesn't. But when it does, it's an interesting process. So when you've got a good financial advisor like Mike and his team, and you go through the financial planning process, one of the things that happens, and one of the things that people tend to just kind of just make a quick assumption, and they say, well, life expectancy. So, what does that take you to? So it takes you to age 90. And when we do financial plans for people, generally speaking, most of your financial plans will go to age 90. It's a bit of a misnomer because the truth is most Canadian males live to about 83, females live to about 85. So 90 is a bit of a stretch. But when we do financial plans, we always want to overcompensate by saying, like, if you happen to be above average and you live longer, you want to make sure you don't run out of money. That's the very basic version of the financial plans that most of you will have already done or you should be doing. But what happens when you get to age 90, and then what happens when you pass away? And so one of the things that for estate and tax planning is really about is what happens after you're gone, what happens after you and your spouse, if you've got a partner, are gone, and does it matter, right? So a lot of times the question is, who cares, right? So why do I need to do estate tax planning at all? And the truth is, a lot of you don't. If you don't care, if there's really no need, if there's enough money, if there's lots of reasons why this might not be relevant, right? So if for example, you're going to retire and based on your financial plan, you're going to live until age 90 and still have lots of money left over. And so if the kids or if the next if the next generation gets less because you have to pay tax, no big deal, right? So by the way, that's a good answer. So as much as, again, I'd like to say that we have better answers, it's not a bad answer to say, fine, you know what, whatever happens, happens. I don't care. I think what's gone on in the last little while, though, is people have seen a few different things get together And really, it's mostly because of outside factors. So as much as you may not care, the government cares. One of the things that we saw, and this actually just happened in 2024, was the government, the speculation and the idea of raising capital gains tax. And who is that going to affect the most? Estates. So it's actually interesting when you looked at the statistics and who was going to be impacted by a raise in the capital gains rate. It was not the average Canadian. The Liberals were correct in saying that. It was going to really be the top 1 or 2% until you're both gone. And when you're gone and everything is considered sold the day you die, then all of a sudden you become the 1%. So you may not have been that 1% for your entire life, but you become it. And all of a sudden your tax rate goes to what is today, in Ontario, 53.5% or whatever that number is. I can't imagine it's going down. It's only going to go up over time. So that's when that becomes a real number. And would you rather 50 some odd percent of your estate go to the government, or would you rather make an investment that could cover off some or all of that tax bill? So that's estate tax planning in a nutshell. But one of the other things, it's not just about spouses and kids and next generations. We've seen a lot of people where we use corporate money, and that's an interesting angle. And if the people on this call have a corporation, they might feel like their money is a little bit trapped. And that can be because, the money gets inside the corporation, it gets taxed at a different rate. To take money out as a dividend or its salary, and even in retirement, it becomes taxed. And then at death, the corporation has to be dissolved, or there's shares that have to be transferred, and there's tax on that as well. So a lot of times people feel like they've done a lot of savings and they've done really good planning for living. And then when they're going to pass away, all of it just goes to the government, and a lot of it can. And again, governments, and especially most recently, have been kind of chipping away at all the different ways you can take advantage of current tax rules to minimize those taxes. So a few years ago, they got rid of tax sprinkling. They created the passive income tests on corporations. So all of this has led to, and it's a long way of saying that there are other solutions out there. A lot of them actually are insurance, and they're not necessarily because you just want to leave a big lump sum to your spouse or child or grandchild. It's because it actually makes a lot of tax sense. The other thing that it's really interesting that's been going on for the last little while has been charity. So one of the rules that's come into play has been, donating shares of stock to a donor advised fund or directly to a charity, and having no capital gains and then getting the full tax receipt for it. Doing that with corporate dollars is even a better idea. So there's lots of interesting ways to do that. Another thing you can do is use insurance. And you can set up what's called a donor advised fund. Asante's got one. You can have an insurance policy paid for inside that donor advised fund. So there's lots of really interesting charitable things, causes, lots of situations where we see people looking for other solutions for after they're gone that isn't just about leaving a big sum for your kid or for your spouse. So all that to be said, tax and estate planning, in my mind, isn't always necessary, but you have to tell me, if you think any of those issues are relevant to you, then there are some solutions. So I'm going to walk you through a number of those solutions today. I'll try to make it as quick and painless as I can. I know insurance isn't necessarily the most fun conversation to have, and it usually involves killing my clients, at least in theory. So I apologize in advance. But the truth is, it is interesting in terms of how you can use it as a tool that's more than just a death benefit. So that brings me to my next kind of segment of this talk, and that is that there's really two kinds of insurance. There's what people say life insurance, but the truth is, I would say there's death insurance and then there's life insurance. And so let me explain. So death insurance, in my mind, is you pick a number that you've gone through your estate plan, you've gone through everything else, you've spoken to your accountant and lawyer, and they said if you buy a policy for $1 million and it's paid off when you die, $1 million, and then you're good to go. That's death insurance. So you just pay enough just to cover off that $1 million fee, that tax bill that you're then going to cover off with insurance, and that's it. So there are lots of solutions for that. They're fairly straightforward. They're mostly what are called universal life insurance policies. You can get a little fancy with them, and you can play with them with investments inside them and have funds that you can buy and trade inside a life insurance policy. Personally, not a huge fan. I think if you're going to take risk in your investments, speak to your financial advisor. I think that's what financial advisors are for. I think when it comes to insurance, I think you'd rather have something a little bit different and a little bit something that you wouldn't do outside. And frankly, the fees on most of the investments that are inside universal life policies are quite high. So I'm not a huge fan from that perspective, although they do have their place. And we do have clients that it makes sense for them to own. And if you've got legacy ones, they're probably worth keeping. But it's something to look at. So in my mind, that's one kind of death insurance. If we've got a little bit of a younger crowd, term insurance is something that everybody buys when they're younger, when they've got a mortgage and they've got kids and they've got large debts. And you can buy a 10 or a 20-year term insurance policy for relatively little money. So a $2 or $3 or $5 million term insurance policy on somebody who's under 35 can be as little as $100 or $200 a month. And it's really just a lump sum payment if you get hit by a bus. So we often use that scenario in terms of, if you get hit by a bus, what happens? The first one that I was talking about was more like an estate freeze. If you died today, this is what the bill would be. So go out and buy this insurance and it'll cover the bill. That's death insurance. To me, that's not very interesting. It's useful. It's good to know. It's a good number to know. That's part of estate planning. So I would tell you it's very helpful to go through the process to make sure that you understand what that number is and what that solution would look like. And if the numbers make sense, you can solve for that number. But I actually would like to show you a different version. So life insurance, in my mind, is something that's dynamic, something that gives you a much more interesting way of sheltering money while you're alive, potentially accessing money inside a life insurance policy while you're alive, earning a dividend that's tax-free inside that life insurance policy that's pretty attractive. I can walk you through that as well. And then having it possibly owned in different structures. So one of the things that permanent life insurance can do, term can do it as well, but we recommend permanent life insurance, mostly participating whole life insurance, to be owned by either individuals, corporations, trusts, and there's all sorts of ways that you can own it and actually take advantage of all the different characters. So before I go any further, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show you a real life example. Here is, and I used Mike's name as the example. So Mike, I just turned you into a 63-year-old male. And let's see here if that works. There you go. Are you guys able to see my screen? Mike, can you see it?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, great. So here is a real life example of what it would look like if you were a 63-year-old male. And again, you can do this in lots of different versions. Normally, we would actually do it on a couple so that you have what's called a joint last to die. But again, the numbers are just here for example. So we just said, okay, here is a 63-year-old man, and he's got a portfolio in either his non-registered account or his RIF account or his corporation. And I'll go through why all those three areas are potentially relevant for something like this. And what you could do with $50,000 a year. So again, it doesn't have to be that much. It can be much more. It can be much less. That's when Mike was saying it very much depends on your specific situation. I picked this number mostly because it got you $1 million of life insurance on day one. So $50,000 a year for Mike's life insurance policy starts to pay out. And if he died 2 days later, his estate would get $1,084,000. So $1,084,000 and change. But that's not really the important part. So here's how this works. You put in your money, you put in your $50,000, and you're going to see a lot of these tables whenever you go through these illustrations. And I'll try to walk you through what all of these columns mean very quickly. So first of all, your premium. So that's how much you're paying. So as you see, this just goes down the line. That's how much your premium is meant to be every year. Then you've got what's in life insurance, in guaranteed life insurance, which is whole life insurance. You have guaranteed cash values and guaranteed death benefits. These are not super relevant because these assume that the insurance company, in this case it's Sun Life, but they all do it, would actually be paying zero dividend. So if they paid no dividend, they owe you this much anyway. So in terms of the amount of life insurance that you initially bought, that $1,084,000 doesn't change. This cash value, which I'll go into in a minute, also grows by a minimal amount, but this assumes that there's no dividend. This is part of insurance legislation. It has to be offered to clients. It's not really relevant in today's world because no insurance company that offers these policies has stopped paying a dividend since the 60s, I believe, is the last time an insurance company paused a dividend for 1 year. And so for the last 50 some odd years, there's nobody that hasn't paid a dividend. In Sun Life's case, they've paid a dividend every year for 150 plus years. So they've actually paid a dividend longer than Canada was incorporated. So that's why we tend to go with the larger of the three companies, Manulife, Sun Life, and Canada Life. That way we've got some good backing. So the guaranteed numbers are nice, but I would tell you to generally ignore them. And then we go over to this side. This is what is the current dividend scale. So in Sun Life's case, they are currently paying 6.25%. So that is what this dividend represents, but it's interesting. So in year one, you've put in 50 grand. It started out as $1,084,000. At the end of the year, it paid a dividend. That dividend was 33,000 and change, and it went and bought a little bit more insurance as well. So very similar to a mutual fund or a stock that pays a dividend. You go to buy more, you pay a dividend, it buys more shares. And in this case, it bought more death benefit. So it went up a little bit, went up from $1,084,000 to $1,089,000, and it started crediting some cash value. In the early years, the cash value will not be as much as what you put in. So if you notice, in year one, you put in $50,000 and it's just under 34. In year two, you put in another $50,000 and now it's at 75. But by year 5, 6, 7, or 8, somewhere in there, you will have put in as much money as you can cash out. So what's interesting about this is, whereas with most other life insurance policies, you don't get the opportunity to get your money back unless you're paying a lot of money. In this case, you can get your money back. So after 10 years, you've put $500,000 into this policy. And if you wanted to cancel the policy and they paid their current dividend scale, you would get $500,000 back. You'd have very little tax to pay on that because it's really just your money in. So you could really just have the coverage, wait 10 years, and if you needed to cash it out and just stop it, you can get your money back. So we like these policies because they do have that backup of, it's not just money for when you're dead, you can actually see it while you're alive. One of the other things that we do with these policies, we often illustrate it as a 20-year story. Usually we try to go towards life expectancy. So in this case, if you have a 64-year-old person, that takes them to the age of 83. So by age 83, they stop paying their dividends. And this is how we've illustrated this one. There's lots of variables on this. So this is just one way to do it. But we've said, okay, make payments for 20 years and then stop paying. So what happens in year 21? Your $1,084,000 turns into $1.7 million of life insurance, and your cash value goes up to $1.1 million. So you've put in $1 million. You've now got $1.1 million in cash value. You stop paying. The policy stays in force, and the policy now covers itself. So you can still always get your money back at any point along this time. You now can access these dollars while you're alive. I'll explain that in a second. But in the early 80s, you can stop paying. And here's the neat part. So you now, if you go back into your financial plan, and you look at, okay, life expectancy, age 90. You're still at that 1.7 million, but there's also 1.4 million in cash value. If at any point during this period of time here, you needed to dip into money. So let's say you've got a portfolio and you've got a corporation or a family trust, an RSP that turned into a RIF, and some non-registered investments, and then you sell a home and downsize and all the things that generally happen as people get towards that higher end of retirement and the higher end of senior living. You might need more money for things like care. Well, here's another pile of money that you can access while you're alive. And there's a very interesting way to do it. So you could actually just take, let's say you're in year, this particular year here, you're at 88 years old, you need an extra 10 grand a month because you're in a home or you need some extra care in your own home. For whatever, or if you want to buy a boat, doesn't really matter why, but you can say, I want this, I need an extra $10,000 a month. So we would say, okay, you can take $10,000 a month, or you can borrow $10,000 a month. And here's the interesting part. So if you took that money and you just took it out of the policy, you'd have to pay a little bit of tax. If it was owned by your corporation, it would have to be paid by a corporation and then paid out to you as a dividend. You'd pay tax twice. If you take this policy and you walk into a bank, walk into any bank, or you can take it to Sun Life and say, I'd like to take a loan based on the cash value of this policy. So today that cash value in that year is 1.35 million. I want $10,000 a month. Charge me whatever interest you want because I'm not going to pay it. Just roll it into my loan. When you die, and let's say, so you've now borrowed out $10,000 a month, $120,000 a year, plus interest, and you pass away at age 90. Your policy is at 1.7, and you owe them $300,000 in a loan plus interest. They're going to pay off the loan. Your beneficiaries still get $1.4 million tax-free, and you never paid tax on the income because it was a loan, it wasn't income. So the net result of all of that is really interesting because at the end of the day, what you're doing is, and I'll turn this off for a second just so you can see me, and I want to just see if there's anybody raising any hands or having any questions. Please let me know, Mike, by the way, because I'm not looking at that as much. But if, for example, you were to take a loan and or not take a loan, and just take it out as cash, you pay tax. But in this case, you put money in, it grew tax-free in terms of the dividend, the cash value grew tax-free while you were alive. You borrowed money out tax-free, didn't pay any income on it. And when you died, life insurance paid out tax-free. If you do this in a corporate environment, you then used corporate dollars, which charge less in terms of tax than your personal dollars do. And then the same thing, it grew tax-free, you borrowed out tax-free, it pays out tax-free at death through your corporation as well. So it's a really interesting strategy and tool to shelter money. I would tell you it is probably one of the last shelters available to Canadians who either have corporations, trusts, or just non-registered money that the government usually and can't actually attack. So I think, when we look at what they did with capital gains last year, accountants, when you speak to them, they're all worried about what happens with the principal residence exemption and those kinds of things. So I think there's lots of places where the government may down the road look to take tax from. Insurance is an interesting animal. Insurance has got its own act. It's not part of the Tax Act. It's the Insurance Act. And insurance gets grandfathered. So you buy a policy like this today, and you are under today's rules. If they change the rules in the future, it doesn't matter. Your rules stick with the rules that you did when you bought it. So one of the advantages of insurance is it gets grandfathered. So there were a number of different rule changes over the years. There were policies that were bought back in the 80s. If you bought a policy pre-1982, you had better numbers. 2016, they did another actuarial calculation where they changed a bunch of numbers on people. So if you had a pre-2016 policy, it was a better deal than a post-2016 policy. But I believe that the government of today and the governments of the future will continue to look for ways to collect more tax. I think they view estates as rich people money. And I think what they don't realize is that it's a lifetime of savings that you spent all of your life saving on that you then are going to have to pay 50 some odd % tax on today. Imagine what that number might be 20 or 30 years from now. So that's the argument for insurance. That's the argument for a specific kind of insurance. This is participating whole life insurance. One of the things that we like to talk about is also the fact that it also is an interesting investment strategy. So while I'm not nearly as much of an expert as Mike and his team are when it comes to investments, I can tell you that one of the things that is interesting and that I find interesting is how these policies pay their dividends. And it is one of the variables that you should understand. It's the one risk that you've got in buying this policy. We don't know what that dividend will be until they declare it every year. So for the last number of years, it's been 6.25%. That's been the lowest it's been in quite some time. And actually, I'll pull up a different example right now. Let me just share my screen again, and I'll show you. This is their participating account. So Sun Life, and I'll show you Sun Life because I believe that they are probably one of the better companies out there, but other companies have similar participating accounts. They manage roughly $1 trillion of money inside this portfolio. And one thing you'll notice is in terms of all of the different things on the pie chart, only less than 20% of it is stocks. So it is very unrelated to almost everything else you would own. That is, a lot of it is in private fixed income, corporate bonds, government bonds, commercial mortgages, real estate. So things that are not stock market related. And that has been a real game changer in terms of diversifying your assets. So this is the portfolio that you would most likely not be able to access anywhere else. So even if it was just a matter of adding a bit of money to something that was a little bit different and a little bit more stable. So here's another example. And this is,
Jay, sorry, let me interrupt for a sec. Can you zoom in on the numbers? I think it's
yes.
A bit difficult to see.
On the pie chart?
Yeah.
Yeah. How's that?
Better.
So it's interesting in terms of just the breakdown, in terms of the average client's portfolio in Canada. You would normally look at the opposite. You would probably, to get growth in the last 30 or 40 years, you would have needed significantly more equities than 20%. So in a very boring, stable, conservative portfolio, you wouldn't expect to get a decent rate of return. But what's been happening in Sun Life's case, and here's the example again, is quite different. So over the last 25 years, the Sun Life Par dividend account, the interest rate that they've been paying, the average was 7.1%. That's over the last 25 years as of December 24th of 2024. So not this current year, but up to last year. The Toronto Stock Exchange has also done 7.2%. The difference is the volatility. So when you measure volatility, there's a couple ways of doing it. There's what's called standard deviation. So these are these numbers here. They're roughly around 16% for the Toronto stock market, and the Sun Life par account is less than 1%. So they got you to almost the same place with way less volatility. So it's a really interesting way to invest. A couple other ways that they like to show it. This is, and before I go you through that, I'll just show you this quick chart. This is a lovely chart that they always like to show. The blue line is the Toronto stock market since 1990, the ups and downs, and the yellow line is the Sun Life dividend par account. So, it's just a flat spot. And you're going to have years where it does much better, but that's why you've got investments as well. We would never recommend that people put all their money into something like this, but a chunk, just a piece, maybe 5% or maybe 10% of a portfolio or something like that. That's a conversation that you would have with Mike and his team. And this is, again, just going back to looking at how the dividend interest rate has gone since the 90s. So it started out in the 90s at almost 11%, went down consistently, basically with interest rates. So as interest rates kept dropping, these dividend rates keep dropping as well. Interestingly, in 2008, 2009, when the market was crashing, these portfolios actually went up significantly because so much money got piled into these things as a safety that they had so much money extra, they paid it out. And they actually had to close the books for a while. You could not buy this at the end of 2008 and for a large part of 2009. They had too much money. And then it just slowly kept on going, 7.4, 7.15, 6.25. It went to 6%, and now it's back up to 6.25%. And it's been like that for the last few years. One of the interesting things about this is only part of how you get, how they get that 6.25% number is interesting. So when you look at their performance, and this is the Sun Life par account yield. So it still can be a little bit volatile. In 2022, it lost a bit of money. It's had years where the performance of it itself, the actual $1 trillion that's invested, it's had years where it's made 2%, it's made 6%, it's lost 7%. So it's averaged out at 7%. In 2024, it made just under 6%, which is fine, because you have to, one thing that's interesting and people forget, when you buy these policies, you're not just buying a portfolio that's got all those bonds in that lovely pie chart. You're also buying a participating policy. You are participating in the profits of the insurance company. And what that means is, of the 6.25%, roughly 4.75 of it is part of that performance of that big portfolio. The other 2% or 1.5%, depending on the year, is on how Sun Life makes money. And how do they make money? Generally selling other kinds of insurance to other people. So you get a dividend from Sun Life from their profits before stockholders, before bondholders. You're a policyholder, so you come first. So it's an interesting mix of a very conservative bond portfolio and participating in the profits of a large insurance company that's got a footprint all over the world. So as an investment, it's a really interesting investment. And just to kind of sum up, it's a really neat idea in terms of both a tax estate planning tool. It's very interesting in terms of potential income later on in life, as long as you've got time to build up that cash value, where you could take tax-free income in the form of a loan. It's got a very interesting profile in terms of an alternative asset class that it can act in a way that will almost be a diversifier to the rest of your investments. And at the end of the day, it's a really interesting way to save tax, both in life and at death. So with that, I would tell you, if there's any questions, let me know. But that's the idea. The idea is that you may not need it, but you might actually want it. And it might actually be something that is of interest to you. And as I said, the real, who needs this? So I would tell you a lot of people do. But I would say one of the things that we've noticed, there's really kind of three categories of people who I think this is most suitable for. First are people with money inside corporations. If you've got cash inside a corporation, there's a really good argument to say insurance is really the last bastion of a tax shelter for corporate dollars. So there's a different conversation we can have about that. The second is non-registered money. So let's say you've got money in GICs or just cash in the bank and you're making 3 or 4%. You have to remember that's taxable. This is earning 6.25% tax-free. So it's just a higher amount of return on your money. There are some catches because it's inside a policy. You've got to make sure that you've got the liquidity to cover it. You've got to pay for it for a number of years. So it's not exactly a fair apples to apples comparison, but I would rather always earn 6 and change tax-free than 3 and change and get taxed on it. So that's open money. And the last part I would tell you is something that's been more interesting these days has been what we call excess RIF money. So for those of you who've got a RIF, and you've also got a pension, you've got other stuff, and you're not living off your RIF, and you're taking those mandatory RIF amounts that they make you take out, and you're putting it into a TFSA or something else, consider putting it into a life insurance policy instead. It can become an interesting another bucket of money that you can build up over time. And again, you can access, that you can still use while you're alive, but it still then transfers to the next generation tax-free as opposed to taxable in any other form. So with that, that's really it. I hope it wasn't too burdensome with all the technicalities. But as I said, Mike and I are around. We'd much rather do this on a very specific situation. We can tailor it to what makes sense for you. But I hope you understood the concept, and I hope it's something that was of interest to you. Anything else? Questions?
So Jay, I'd like to add something to everything you're saying. So I agree with absolutely everything, of course. And the interesting thing to me is when you think of it from an investment perspective, and you kind of touched on this, it is essentially a hedge to the market. So with everything else that's going on right now, we have the volatility in the US, the global uncertainty, the stock market volatility. This is essentially an investment opportunity that's invested in something completely different that's not tied to the market. So, in all of and oftentimes in our client meetings, we're talking about ways to diversify, not only through investments, but also through strategies. So we do have clients with GICs and cash and money market and investments and mutual funds. And, now more recently, private markets. But now this to me is another opportunity to further protect your portfolio.
And I agree, and I would tell you the only thing that I would add is that in many ways it is a much safer way to diversify your portfolio because it acts as a hedge, but it's also a super conservative hedge.
Right.
It doesn't. One of the things that in those numbers, when you see those cash values, one of the things that I forgot to mention was those numbers never go down. We don't know how much they'll go up by every year, and we don't know until they declare their dividend what you're going to collect that year in terms of a dividend. But once you've got $300,000 of cash value, it can never go down. So you can't say that about too many other strategies and investments where there's a floor where it can never go below. We don't know how much it'll make the next year, but we know that once you've got that statement that says your cash value is X, it never goes down unless you take it out. So it's very comforting, especially as you said, Mike, in these markets, to know that there's a thing out there that's still got some value to it, that's really solid, that's very conservative, and that still is it's a conservative hedge, which is an unusual use of. It's kind of like saying army intelligence, but it is a conservative hedge. It works quite well.
And the other interesting thing, I think, which is more and more common, is for individual clients who have spent decades accumulating and now they have this substantial RSP account, and you're in your mid 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and you have $1 million plus RSP account, you're going to start running into trouble decumulating that account. So taking out money without paying too much in taxes. So if you already have your pension and now you're converting to a RIF and it's forcing you to take more income, you may potentially land in a higher tax bracket in retirement than you did when you were working. And then
Yep.
And then from an estate perspective, if you pass away with $1 million RIF account or RSP account, the government's taking $500,000 right off the bat.
Correct.
So
that's been very interesting for us in terms of, like, we've seen a number of clients where what I've said is kind of excess RIF income, and that's where they've been happily trying to buy a life insurance policy just to cover that risk.
Great. We have a couple of questions here. So first, I'll give you both of them and then you can answer both. So is there a max age for insurance? Or I guess the question is insurability.
Yep. And so the answer to that is yes. Usually it's age 80. If you're a couple, if there's two people, as long as one of them is under the age of 80, you can actually have somebody that's older. You just have to check the numbers and see if they actually make sense. So you can get insurance. We've got a client right now. He's 82. His spouse is 78, and they're applying for insurance, and the numbers make sense. So it can still work. But the trick is, you have to remember, these are not just financial vehicles, they're still life insurance. And so you have to go through the medical fight, like you have to actually be underwritten and they have to go through all your medical files. And when you're 82 and you've had lots of stuff in your medical history, it's quite a thick file. So before, these assume that you are of standard health for your age. Standard health for an 82-year-old male who's had a heart problem in the past isn't necessarily going to get you a standard rate. So we have to make sure that they get approved at standard rates to make the money make sense. So, one of the things that I would tell anybody that's interested is always apply. It never costs anything to apply. It takes a while to get approved. It can take months to get approved. And then once you're down that road and you understand that you've been approved or you've been rated, or you could be declined, we've got a number of people that can be declined for lots of reasons, then you can actually make your final decision. But, it's all academic until you actually apply. So I would always encourage people to apply. There's really no cost. We don't mind doing the paperwork as long as you don't mind getting a little bit of invasion in terms of the nurse and the blood and the urine and all that stuff. But it doesn't hurt to apply. And one of the things that I would also say on that subject is, there's a very interesting saying in the insurance world anyway, where there's insurance medicine and then there's medicine. So, medicine can say you're an 82-year-old man, you had a heart problem in the 60s, you've been taking medicine for it ever since, and you're totally fine, and you're healthy for an 82-year-old. And in the insurance world, that same guy's got a little bit of high blood pressure, he's had cholesterol, he had a heart problem, he had some skin cancer, they removed it, but it's fine. And by the time you go down the list, he's ticked enough boxes that he's uninsurable. Now, he's totally healthy, and there's nothing wrong with him, he just can't get insurance. So there's a bit of people, get a little bit confused. Well, why would they decline me? They get a little offended by it. They have their own algorithm. They have their own, it's based on statistics, right? So it's got nothing to do with an opinion on whether or not you're actually healthy. It's just the stats of that particular company and how they work. But I would tell anybody that's mildly interested, go through the process, see if you get approved, and then you can pick your number and figure out what you want to do. I can see the other question there, like, did all the payouts for life insurance due to COVID affect the dividend payouts? No. The only thing that affected the payouts during COVID was the fact that the bond market went down. So what happened was, they actually ended up, COVID actually increased life expectancy that year. Because what happened was, as much as people were unfortunately passing away from COVID, way less people were dying of car accidents and other things because they weren't out. So when you look at the stats in 2020 and into 2021, a little bit as well, life expectancy in Canada actually went up those years. So they actually paid out less those years. But what was interesting was the year after, when the stock market and the bond market went down, the dividend rate actually dropped. And the dividend went from 6.25 to 6 because bonds lost money that year. So I would tell you that when it comes to these products, the insurance companies are very good, and they all are. Sun Life is very good at it. So is Manulife in Canada. They're very good at assessing their risk from an actuarial perspective. They spend a lot of time and energy figuring out life expectancies of the average person who buys their policy, but they can't control markets. So that's the one thing that I would tell you is actually interesting now, is that they've gone through that swing of where bonds just dropped in 2022, and they were able to, and interest rates went up significantly. They were able to lock in higher interest rates for the next 20 and 30 years. So I'm much more comfortable today, and so are the insurance companies, telling you that the dividend is much more reasonable to expect to stay in that same range today than it would have been 7 years ago. 7 years ago, we were talking about dividend -1 or -2 when we would talk to people. Today, we talk about dividend -0.5. So I think that they're much more comfortable with it. We are much more comfortable with making sure that we're giving conservative estimates on those dividends. Anything else?
I think there's one that is on its way.
Yep. What is required to increase an existing policy? Yep. So it's difficult. An existing policy, if it's got, some policies have riders where you can add more without a medical. That's probably 5 or 10% of the policies out there. Most policies, if they were sold in the last 10 or even 20 years, what you bought is what you get. There is one factor in these policies that we often show to clients as well, and it's getting a little bit into the weeds here, but basically there's what's called a plus premium. So let's say the cost of your insurance is $50,000. You can also add an extra $20,000, let's make up a number, of $20,000 of what's called plus premium, and that just strictly goes right to the dividend account. So that's a number that you can play with. So you owe the insurance company $50,000 a year for your life insurance, but you're adding an extra 20 just because you want to shelter more dollars. So you can do that. And then if in a year you don't want to do that, you can actually turn that off, the 20 grand, and then you can turn it back on again in a year later. So that's where people can add, and then they can add to existing insurance. That insurance, when that dividend comes out, because it's now 70,000 that was paid in, the dividend that buys more life insurance that year is based on the full 70,000. So you do actually get more life insurance, even though you didn't apply for it. You applied for something that cost 50, but you got insurance that cost 70. So there is a way to increase it. It's a little bit more complicated, but generally speaking, you got to buy a new policy.
And if I could interject there, I will say, if you are curious, if you do have insurance, we can have a call and just review what you currently have to see what the options are. If there is a way to increase it or maybe even switch the type of policy, there's potentially always options. But that's, as Jay said earlier, it's more of a case by case. So feel free to book something and we'll review it.
Yeah.
Also, I just wanted
we do it often. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, and I also wanted to just mention, in case it wasn't apparent. So when Jay's talking about insurance premiums, he is talking about larger numbers. And so you may be sitting thinking, well, I have my investment accounts and I don't really keep a substantial balance in my bank account. So how do I fund this insurance policy? And, when Jay said earlier, 5-10% of your portfolio value, what we typically do with our existing clients is you have your investments fund your insurance policy. So if it's a $20,000 insurance policy premium, that's coming from your investment portfolio. So, and we take care of the administrative end of things. So it's not like you have to accumulate $20,000 in your bank account and it comes out of your bank account.
Correct. And then I just saw another question from Dale. If I retire to Spain, what happens? That's actually a good question. A lot of
That's on everyone's wish list, by the way.
Yeah, but so we've had a lot of that. So basically, it depends on where you're resident when you apply. So they will pay out all over the world. One of the questions they ask you on the applications is, do you intend to change your residency in the next year or two, depending on the company? So as long as you intend to be a resident of Canada for the next 1 or 2 years, you're fine. Even if you are currently a resident of Canada and you're contemplating it, but you don't really have plans yet, you haven't bought a place, you haven't really settled on everything, you're fine. If you are, so we've got a number of clients who work overseas and then, they're dual residents, it can get a little bit more complicated in terms of taxes. So the only thing you need to be careful of, Sun Life will pay out. So it's not a question of, they will pay you your $1 million life insurance death benefit when you die. They'll pay it to your spouse or to your child or whoever you want it to go to. If your spouse and you are both retiring in Spain, you should always check, how does Spain treat life insurance proceeds, right? So one of the things we've noticed is, depending on the country, even in the United States, depending on the state, there are some states that life insurance proceeds do have a tax on them. So if you retire in North Carolina, it could be that you've got a 5% tax on life insurance proceeds. So you might not want to retire in a state. So that's why people ultimately moved to Florida, because there was no estate tax. But check, the one other thing that people forget about is, life insurance is not tax-free all over the world. So wherever you're going, check what the tax story is on that side, and if they would want to collect some tax on your proceeds.
And so with Spain, for example, I believe there is an inheritance tax, and that typically would mean there would be tax on insurance, I would guess.
Correct. And it would mean, like, let's say, for example, and I don't know, let's take Dale's the example, right? But let's say if Dale's got a spouse and that spouse wants the money in Spain, then they'll have to pay the tax. If Dale's leaving that to a kid who lives in Canada, then chances are there's no issue, because no money's actually going to his estate or his spouse who's inheriting his estate, who's in Spain. So it really depends on who it's going to, what country that person's in as well. So you just gotta, once you make that decision to retire in a place like Spain, ask somebody in Spain how this should work. And there are ways to get around some of those things. So I know in many European countries, they'll advise you to set up a trust so that you can avoid that tax.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay.
That was excellent. I'm not sure if there's any other questions. If not, again, you're more than welcome to click a link and we'll talk more personally about your individual case. But it looks like there is nothing else in the pipeline in terms of questions, so we can end it here. Jay, appreciate the time you took, and
My pleasure.
yeah, thanks again.
Okay. Enjoy your afternoon. Take care.
Perfect. See ya.
Okay. Bye-bye.